Story disclaimer. This story is a work of fiction and is intended for entertainment purposes only. The content includes dark themes, horror elements, and fictional depictions of rituals and sacrifices that are purely imaginative and not reflective of any real-life practices or beliefs. Viewer discretion is advised. This video is not suitable for younger audiences, and parental guidance is recommended. The story does not endorse or promote any harmful behavior, violence, or dangerous activities. Please note that all characters, events, and settings are entirely fictional and created for the purpose of storytelling. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events, is purely coincidental. As Amina and Kofi navigate a narrow, shadowy passage, they are enveloped by the whispers of lost souls and chilling visions that threaten to consume them. In a haunting cavern, they confront twisted reflections in an ancient mirror, battling nightmarish versions of themselves. With the power of light, they shatter the dark illusions, but the eerie silence that follows only hints at the darker challenges yet to come. What sinister trials await them in the shadows beyond? The passage that led away from the chamber was narrow and claustrophobic, the walls lined with dark, shifting shadows that seemed to close in on them with each step. The air was thick and heavy, as if it carried the weight of untold stories and unspeakable horrors. Amina and Kofi moved cautiously through the narrow passage, their hearts pounding in sync with the distant echoes of their footsteps. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting as if alive, and the shadows twisted into grotesque shapes that flickered in and out of existence. As they ventured deeper into the passage, a cold wind began to howl through the narrow space, carrying with it the faint whispers of voices long silenced. The voices were indistinct at first, mere murmurs that seemed to brush against their minds like the fluttering wings of trapped birds. But as they pressed on, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they formed a chorus of despair that filled the passage with an overwhelming sense of dread. Amina clutched Kofi's hand tightly, her eyes scanning the darkness ahead. She could feel the weight of the voices pressing in on her, their despairing cries echoing in her mind. The passage seemed to stretch endlessly before them, the walls closing in as if the darkness itself sought to consume them. Suddenly, the passage opened up into a vast cavern, its walls lined with jagged, crystalline formations that shimmered with an eerie, ghostly light. The floor was uneven, covered in a thick layer of dust and debris that crunched underfoot. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the cavern was filled with an oppressive silence, broken only by the distant sound of dripping water. At the center of the cavern stood a massive, ancient mirror, its surface cracked and tarnished with age. The frame was ornate, carved with intricate patterns that seemed to writhe and twist as if alive. The mirror's surface was clouded, reflecting only a distorted, shadowy image of the cavern. Amina and Kofi approached the mirror cautiously, their reflections flickering in and out of view as they moved. The whispers grew louder, forming a dissonant chorus of anguished voices that filled the cavern with an overwhelming sense of dread. As they stood before the mirror, the surface began to ripple, as if disturbed by an unseen force. The distorted reflections wavered, and the shadows within the mirror began to take on a life of their own. The glass seemed to darken, and the images within began to shift and change, forming twisted, nightmarish visions that sent shivers down their spines. Amina gasped as she saw herself reflected in the mirror, but it was not her true self. The reflection was twisted, distorted, her eyes hollow and lifeless, her face gaunt and aged beyond recognition. The reflection seemed to stare back at her with a malevolent gleam, a cruel smile playing at the corners of its cracked lips. Kofi's reflection was equally horrifying. His once bright eyes were now empty voids, his skin pale and sickly. The boy in the mirror was no longer the lively, hopeful child Amina had come to love, but a withered, twisted version of himself, drained of life and hope. The mirror's surface rippled again, and the twisted reflections began to move of their own accord, stepping out of the mirror and into the cavern. The air grew colder, and the whispers became a cacophony of tormented cries. The reflections moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, their hollow eyes fixed on Amina and Kofi. Amina tried to back away, but the twisted version of herself reached out with a skeletal hand, its fingers curling around her arm with a grip like iron. The touch was ice cold, sending a shock of fear through her body. She struggled to break free, but the twisted reflection was unnaturally strong, pulling her closer with each passing second. Kofi's twisted reflection advanced on him, its hollow eyes fixed on the boy with a predatory hunger. It reached out with clawed hands, its nails digging into his flesh as it tried to drag him into the darkness. Desperation surged within Amina. She knew that if they were pulled into the mirror, they would be lost forever in the nightmare world that lay beyond its surface. With a cry of defiance, she called upon the crystal's light, focusing its energy on the twisted reflections. The light flared brilliantly, piercing the darkness of the cavern and striking the twisted reflections with a searing, blinding force. The reflections recoiled, their forms distorting and warping as the light burned through them. They let out a chorus of agonized screams, their bodies writhing in torment as they were driven back toward the mirror. The light intensified, and the reflections began to dissolve, their forms disintegrating into shadowy tendrils that were sucked back into the mirror. The surface of the mirror rippled violently, the glass cracking and shattering as the twisted reflections were consumed by the light. With a final, deafening scream, the last of the reflections vanished into the mirror, leaving the cavern in a deep, oppressive silence. The mirror's surface was shattered, the broken shards reflecting only fragments of the cavern's ghostly light. Amina and Kofi stood in the silence, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The cavern was still, the air thick with the lingering echoes of the twisted visions they had just faced. The danger had passed, but the darkness was far from over. With a weary glance at the shattered mirror, Amina took Kofi's hand and led him away from the cavern. The passage ahead was dark and foreboding, but they had no choice but to press on. The haunting visions had been but one of many trials, and the path ahead promised even darker and more terrifying challenges. Chapter 17: The Abyss of Tormented Souls. The next chamber they entered was unlike anything they had encountered before. It was a vast, open space, its walls stretching up into a pitch-black void that seemed to swallow all light. The ground was uneven, covered in jagged rocks and deep chasms that seemed to descend into endless darkness. The air was thick with a palpable sense of dread, and the silence was suffocating. At the center of the chamber was a massive pit, its edges lined with ancient, crumbling stones. The pit was filled with a swirling, dark mist that seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. The mist was alive with the whispers of countless voices, each one filled with anguish and torment. Amina and Kofi approached the pit cautiously, their eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of danger. The mist within the pit seemed to shift and swirl, forming twisted, ghostly shapes that writhed and twisted as if in agony. As they neared the edge of the pit, the voices grew louder, forming a dissonant chorus of anguished cries that filled the chamber with an overwhelming sense of despair. The ground beneath them began to tremble, and the mist within the pit began to rise, forming a towering column of dark energy that reached up into the void above. The column of mist began to take shape, forming the twisted, contorted faces of countless souls trapped within its dark depths. The faces were twisted in expressions of pain and terror, their eyes filled with an unending despair. The souls within the mist reached out with ghostly hands, their fingers grasping at the air as if trying to escape their torment. Amina felt a cold shiver run down her spine as she watched the mist rise higher, the faces of the tormented souls growing more distinct with each passing moment. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the voices of the souls filled the chamber with an overwhelming sense of dread. Suddenly, the mist surged forward, spilling over the edge of the pit and rushing toward Amina and Kofi like a tidal wave of darkness. The ground shook violently, and the air was filled with the deafening screams of the tormented souls. Amina grabbed Kofi's hand and pulled him back, but the mist was relentless, surging forward with a ferocious intensity. The faces of the souls within the mist twisted and contorted, their cries growing louder as they reached out with ghostly hands, their fingers brushing against Amina and Kofi's skin with a cold, unfeeling touch. Desperation surged within Amina as the mist closed in around them. She knew that if they were consumed by the mist, they would be lost forever, trapped within the abyss of tormented souls. With a cry of determination, she focused on the crystal's light, channeling its energy into a blinding beam that cut through the darkness. The light struck the mist with a searing intensity, causing it to recoil with a deafening scream. The faces of the souls within the mist writhed in agony as the light burned through them, their forms disintegrating into wisps of shadowy tendrils that were sucked back into the pit. The mist surged again, but Amina held her ground, her resolve unwavering as she pushed the light forward, driving the darkness back into the pit. The ground shook violently, and the chamber was filled with the echoes of the tormented souls' anguished cries. With a final, blinding flash of light, the mist was driven back into the pit, the swirling column of dark energy collapsing in on itself with a deafening roar. The ground beneath them stabilized, and the air was filled with a heavy silence, broken only by the distant echoes of the souls' cries. Amina and Kofi stood at the edge of the pit, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The abyss of tormented souls was behind them, but the darkness was far from over. The challenges they faced were only beginning, and the path ahead was filled with unknown dangers and dark trials. Amina and Kofi stood at the edge of the pit, their minds reeling from the intensity of what they had just survived. The abyss of tormented souls had been a nightmare made manifest, but they both knew that this was only the beginning of the trials that lay ahead. The very air around them seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, as if the spirits of the abyss were still watching, waiting for another opportunity to drag them down. The silence was thick and oppressive, broken only by the faint sound of dripping water from the cavern walls. But as they began to move away from the pit, a sudden gust of icy wind swept through the chamber, extinguishing the faint light that had guided them. Darkness swallowed the space, and the temperature dropped sharply, making their breath visible in the frigid air. Amina's hand tightened around Kofi's as they strained to see through the impenetrable blackness. But there was something else, something moving in the shadows. The darkness was alive, shifting and swirling around them, and the air filled with a low, haunting chant in a language neither of them understood. The chant was ancient, filled with a power that sent shivers down their spines. It was a summoning, a call to something ancient and terrible. From the depths of the darkness, figures began to emerge. They were tall, their bodies draped in tattered, blood-stained robes that billowed as they moved. Their faces were hidden beneath hooded cloaks, but their eyes, glowing with an eerie, malevolent light, pierced through the darkness. These were no ordinary spirits, they were the ancient guardians of the abyss, bound to protect its secrets from any who dared to trespass. Amina's heart pounded in her chest as the guardians surrounded them, their glowing eyes fixated on her and Kofi. The chanting grew louder, more insistent, and the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. The guardians raised their arms, and in their hands appeared ancient, carved blades that gleamed with a dark, unnatural light. Suddenly, the air around them shimmered, and a figure materialized in front of Amina and Kofi. It was an elderly woman, her skin as dark as the void itself, and her eyes glowing with a fiery intensity. Her hair was wild and matted, adorned with bones and trinkets that rattled with every movement. She wore a necklace of sharp teeth, and her fingers were tipped with long, blackened nails. This was no ordinary spirit, she was a powerful witch, a keeper of the darkest magic, and a servant of the ancient spirits that ruled this cursed place. The witch's voice cut through the chanting like a blade. "You dare to tread upon sacred ground, child. You dare to defy the spirits of the abyss." Amina stepped back, but the witch raised a hand, and a force like an iron grip held her in place. The witch's eyes bored into hers, and Amina felt a wave of dark energy wash over her, seeping into her very soul. "You are strong," the witch hissed, "but strength alone will not save you here. You must prove your worth, or you will be consumed by the darkness that hungers for your soul." Amina felt the weight of the crystal in her hand, its light dimming under the oppressive force of the witch's power. But she would not be cowed. With every ounce of her will, she summoned the light of the crystal, pushing back against the dark magic that threatened to overwhelm her. The witch let out a shrill, cackling laugh. "Foolish child. Do you think the light can save you now? You know nothing of the true power that lies within this place. The spirits will feast on your soul, and you will become one of them, bound to this abyss for all eternity." The guardians began to close in, their blades raised high, ready to strike. But Amina was not ready to surrender. She knew there was a deeper power within the crystal, something she had yet to fully understand. And she knew that to survive, she would have to embrace the darkness she had always feared. With a cry of defiance, Amina raised the crystal high above her head. The light that had once shone pure and bright began to change, darkening as it absorbed the energy around it. The crystal pulsed with a dark, sinister light that seemed to resonate with the very essence of the abyss. The witch's eyes widened in shock, and for a moment, the chanting faltered. The guardians paused, their glowing eyes flickering as they sensed the shift in power. Amina could feel the darkness within the crystal merging with her own spirit, filling her with a new, terrifying strength. The witch snarled, her voice laced with fury. "What have you done, child? You have awakened forces you cannot control." But it was too late. The crystal's light flared, casting long, twisted shadows across the chamber. The guardians recoiled as the light grew stronger, their forms flickering and fading as the dark magic began to tear them apart. Amina could feel the power surging through her, overwhelming her senses. The darkness within the crystal was not just a force, it was alive, ancient, and hungry. It whispered to her, offering her the power to destroy her enemies, to bend the spirits to her will, but at a cost she was not yet willing to pay. Kofi's voice broke through the haze. "Amina, no. Don't let it consume you." His words brought her back from the brink, and with a monumental effort, she forced the darkness back, regaining control of the crystal's power. The light dimmed, returning to its original, pure form, and the guardians vanished into the shadows, their presence lingering only as a faint echo. The witch, however, remained. Her eyes blazed with anger, but there was a hint of something else, fear. She knew that Amina had the power to destroy her, but she also knew that the darkness within the crystal was not yet fully unleashed. "You have won this battle, child," the witch hissed, "but the war is far from over. The spirits of the abyss will not rest until they have claimed your soul." With those final words, the witch dissolved into the shadows, leaving Amina and Kofi alone in the silent chamber. The air was still thick with the lingering presence of dark magic, but the immediate threat had passed. Amina sank to her knees, exhausted from the struggle. She could still feel the darkness within the crystal, waiting, watching, biding its time. She knew that the trials ahead would only grow more difficult, more dangerous, and that the darkness would continue to tempt her at every turn. But for now, they had survived. The path ahead was uncertain, but they would face it together, bound by the light and the darkness that now intertwined within them. As Amina and Kofi continued through the labyrinthine caverns, the air grew heavier, more oppressive with each step. The walls seemed to close in around them, and the darkness thickened, as if the very stones were imbued with ancient, malevolent spirits. The crystal in Amina's hand pulsed faintly, its light struggling to pierce the gloom. They emerged into a chamber unlike any they had seen before. The ceiling was high and vaulted, with intricate carvings that depicted scenes of dark rituals and sacrifices, illuminated by the faint glow of bioluminescent fungi clinging to the walls. In the center of the chamber stood an altar made of black stone, its surface stained with the blood of countless offerings. Around the altar, a circle of ancient symbols had been carved into the stone floor. The symbols pulsed with a dark energy, resonating with the crystal in Amina's hand. She could feel the pull of the magic, the way it tugged at her soul, urging her to step into the circle. Kofi hesitated, his eyes wide with fear. "Amina, we shouldn't be here. This place, it's evil." Amina nodded, but she knew they had no choice. The only way forward was through the dark magic that permeated this chamber. She stepped closer to the altar, feeling the air grow colder, the shadows deepening as she approached. The symbols on the floor began to glow brighter as she neared, and the crystal in her hand pulsed in response. She could feel the darkness within it stirring, awakening as it connected with the magic of the chamber. The power was intoxicating, and Amina could feel herself being drawn in, tempted by the promises of unlimited strength. But she knew that to give in would be to lose herself completely, to become just another spirit bound to this cursed place. She forced herself to focus, to push back against the darkness and keep control. As she stood before the altar, the symbols on the floor flared with a blinding light, and the chamber was suddenly filled with the sound of chanting, low, guttural voices that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. The symbols began to move, shifting and rearranging themselves into new patterns, forming a complex web of dark magic that surrounded Amina. The chanting grew louder, more insistent, and Amina felt the crystal in her hand begin to vibrate, its light flickering as the dark magic tried to overwhelm it. The air was thick with power, and she could feel the presence of the spirits, watching, waiting to see if she would succeed or fail. Suddenly, the ground beneath Amina began to tremble, shaking the very foundation of the chamber. The web of symbols glowed fiercely, the light so intense it seemed to sear into her eyes, but she couldn't look away. The air crackled with dark energy, a storm of malevolent power that threatened to tear the chamber apart. Kofi cried out as he was thrown to the ground, clutching his head as the chanting grew louder, more frenzied. The voices were no longer just an eerie background, they were inside his mind, pressing against his thoughts, driving him to the edge of madness. He struggled to his feet, reaching out to Amina, but an invisible barrier held him back, separating them. "Amina," he shouted, but his voice was lost in the cacophony. Amina stood frozen before the altar, her body rigid as the dark magic enveloped her. She could feel the spirits closing in, their cold, ethereal fingers brushing against her skin, trying to pull her into the void. The crystal in her hand was her only anchor, its light flickering as it fought against the overwhelming darkness. The chanting reached a fever pitch, and the symbols on the floor erupted in flames, black, unnatural flames that burned with a cold fury. The flames licked at Amina's feet, but she felt no heat, only the chill of death that they brought with them. The flames coiled around her, rising higher and higher, until they formed a towering inferno that encircled the altar. In the heart of the flames, a figure began to take shape. It was a massive, shadowy form, its features obscured by the darkness that clung to it like a second skin. Its eyes were the only visible part, two glowing orbs of malevolence that fixed on Amina with an intensity that made her blood run cold. The figure stepped forward, its footsteps echoing like the toll of a funeral bell. It was a creature of pure darkness, born of the abyss and sustained by the countless souls it had devoured. As it moved, the flames parted, revealing a path that led directly to Amina. She tried to back away, but the force of the magic held her in place. The figure loomed over her, its presence suffocating, and she could feel its dark power pressing down on her, crushing her spirit. It spoke, but the words were not in any language she knew, they were the language of the abyss, a tongue that resonated with the deepest fears of her soul. "Who are you to challenge the darkness?" the figure intoned, its voice a deep, rumbling growl that shook the chamber. "You, who are but a speck of light in an ocean of shadows, dare to defy the spirits of the abyss." Amina forced herself to meet the creature's gaze, her grip tightening on the crystal. "I am not here to challenge you," she said, her voice trembling but steady. "I am here to survive." The figure let out a low, mocking laugh. "Survive? In this place of death and despair? Foolish girl, you cannot hope to survive the darkness. It will consume you, as it has consumed all who came before you." Amina felt a surge of anger at the creature's words, the spark of defiance that pushed back against the crushing weight of its presence. "I have faced the darkness before," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I have seen its power, felt its cold touch. But I have also seen the light, and I know that even in the deepest shadows, the light can still shine." The creature's eyes narrowed, and the flames around them flared brighter, as if in response to her defiance. You speak of light, but you carry the darkness within you, it hissed. The crystal you hold is a beacon to the spirits, a conduit for the dark magic that flows through this place. You are already tainted, already marked for death. Amina could feel the truth in the creature's words. The darkness within the crystal had been growing stronger, feeding on the energy of the abyss, and she knew that it was only a matter of time before it consumed her completely. But she also knew that she could not give in, not yet. She closed her eyes, focusing on the crystal, willing the light within it to shine brighter. The darkness pushed back, resisting her efforts, but she forced herself to keep going, drawing on every ounce of strength she had left. The light began to grow, slowly at first, then faster, until it was a blinding beacon that pierced through the darkness. The creature let out a roar of anger, its form flickering as the light intensified. It raised its hand, and a wave of dark energy surged toward Amina, but she held her ground, the crystal's light forming a barrier that deflected the attack. The chamber shook violently, the flames around them sputtering and dying as the light overwhelmed the darkness. With a final, defiant scream, the creature shattered, its form disintegrating into a cloud of black smoke that dissipated into the air. The chanting ceased, and the symbols on the floor dimmed, their power spent. The barrier that had separated Amina and Kofi vanished, and he rushed to her side, catching her as she collapsed from exhaustion. The chamber was silent, the oppressive atmosphere lifted, but the darkness lingered, the reminder of the power that still dwelled within the crystal. Amina knew that they had won a small victory, but the battle was far from over. The spirits of the abyss were still out there, watching, waiting for their next move. But for now, they had survived. And that was enough. As they left the chamber behind, Amina and Kofi found themselves in a narrow passageway that twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the heart of the mountain. The walls were rough and uneven, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. The light from the crystal flickered weakly, its power drained from the battle, but it was still their only source of illumination. They walked in silence, each lost in their thoughts. Amina could still feel the darkness within the crystal, a cold, insidious presence that whispered to her, tempting her with promises of power. She knew that she had to be careful, that the line between using the darkness and being consumed by it was thin. The passageway eventually opened up into a large cavern, its walls lined with ancient carvings that depicted scenes of war and destruction. The floor was littered with bones, the remains of those who had come before them, and in the center of the cavern stood a massive stone doorway, its surface covered in more of the dark symbols they had seen earlier. Kofi knelt beside one of the skeletons, his face grim. "These people, they were sacrificed," he said, his voice heavy with sorrow. "They were brought here to die, to feed the darkness." Amina nodded, her heart heavy. "This place, it's a tomb. A tomb for the souls that were lost to the abyss." Kofi stood, his expression hardening. "We can't let their deaths be in vain. We have to find a way to stop this, to break the cycle." Amina agreed, but she wasn't sure how they could accomplish such a monumental task. The power of the abyss was ancient and overwhelming, and they were just two people, alone in the darkness. But as she approached the stone doorway, she felt a strange sense of familiarity. The symbols on the door seemed to resonate with her, as if they were calling to her, guiding her. She placed her hand on the door, and the symbols began to glow, the light spreading across the surface in intricate patterns. The door rumbled as it slowly began to open, revealing a long, dark corridor beyond. Amina hesitated, but the pull of the crystal urged her forward, and she stepped into the corridor, Kofi close behind. The air was colder here, and the darkness seemed more oppressive, but Amina felt a strange sense of calm. The corridor was lined with more carvings, these ones depicting scenes of a great war between light and darkness, with figures wielding crystals like hers, their light cutting through the shadows. At the end of the corridor, they came to a large chamber, its walls covered in more symbols and carvings. In the center of the chamber stood a pedestal, and on it rested a large, ornate book, its cover made of black leather and embossed with more of the strange symbols. Amina approached the book, her heart racing. She could feel the power emanating from it, a dark, pulsating energy that made her skin crawl. But she also knew that this book was important, that it held the key to understanding the abyss and the power it contained. She reached out and opened the book, the pages filled with ancient text and diagrams that detailed the rituals and spells used by the ancient priests who had once controlled the abyss. The words were difficult to read, the language unfamiliar, but Amina felt a strange connection to them, as if the knowledge was already within her, waiting to be unlocked. As she studied the book, a sudden realization struck her. The rituals described in the book were not just about controlling the abyss, they were about binding it, using the power of the crystals to contain the darkness and prevent it from spreading. As Amina pored over the ancient tome, the chamber around her seemed to darken, the shadows growing longer and deeper. The book's words began to crawl across the page, twisting and warping into grotesque shapes as if the very ink was alive, pulsing with malevolent energy. The air thickened with the stench of decay, and a low, haunting whisper echoed through the chamber, rising from the very walls themselves. Kofi noticed the change immediately, his instinct screaming that they were no longer alone. He glanced around, his hand tightening on the hilt of his knife, but the darkness was impenetrable. Every flicker of shadow seemed to hide a lurking danger, every whisper a threat. He stepped closer to Amina, ready to defend her, but the air between them shimmered, as though the darkness was forming a barrier. Amina's eyes widened as the text in the book shifted before her, rearranging itself into a language she could understand, but one that filled her with dread. The spells and rituals described were not just tools to control the abyss, they were instructions for merging with it, for becoming one with the darkness, and in doing so, wielding unimaginable power. But the cost was severe. To bind with the abyss was to lose one's soul, to be consumed by the very darkness one sought to control. The pages of the book began to turn on their own, flipping faster and faster, as if possessed by an unseen force. The text became more frenzied, the symbols more chaotic, until the pages finally stopped on a single, horrifying image, a human figure, shackled and screaming, as tendrils of darkness burrowed into their flesh, transforming them into a twisted, monstrous being. Amina recoiled, but the pull of the abyss was stronger than ever. The crystal in her hand vibrated violently, resonating with the dark energy of the tome, and she felt a sharp pain in her chest, as if something was trying to claw its way out. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, urging her to take the final step, to complete the ritual and embrace the darkness fully. Kofi, sensing the danger, lunged forward to pull her away from the book, but as he reached out, the shadows around Amina solidified into a wall of black, forcing him back. He watched in horror as Amina's eyes began to glow with an eerie, unnatural light, her face contorted in pain and fear. "Amina," he shouted, but his voice was drowned out by the deafening roar of the abyss, a sound that seemed to come from the depths of the earth itself. Amina could feel the darkness closing in on her, wrapping around her like a suffocating shroud. The power of the abyss was intoxicating, promising her everything she had ever wanted: power, control, the ability to protect those she loved, but at the cost of her humanity. She struggled to resist, to fight back, but the darkness was relentless, dragging her deeper into its embrace. Suddenly, the crystal in her hand flared with a brilliant light, cutting through the darkness like a knife. The shadows recoiled, hissing and writhing as the light intensified, pushing them back. Amina felt a surge of strength, a flicker of hope, and she grasped the crystal tightly, focusing all her will on the light within. The darkness fought back, but the light was stronger, fueled by Amina's determination. Slowly, the shadows began to recede, retreating into the corners of the chamber. The wall of black around her shattered, then Kofi rushed forward, grabbing her arm and pulling her away from the tome. The moment their hands touched, the chamber erupted in chaos. The ground beneath them cracked and split, and the walls began to crumble, the ancient stone giving way to the raw, seething power of the abyss. The tome flew from the pedestal, its pages scattering like leaves in a storm, and a deafening howl filled the air, the sound of the abyss enraged. Kofi dragged Amina toward the corridor, but the way back was blocked by a swirling vortex of darkness, a portal to the very heart of the abyss. The walls of the chamber began to close in, the stone collapsing inward as if the mountain itself was being devoured by the darkness. With no other option, Kofi turned toward a narrow passage at the far end of the chamber, barely visible in the chaos. He pulled Amina with him, and together they sprinted toward the passage, the ground shaking beneath their feet as the chamber disintegrated behind them. They plunged into the darkness of the passage, the roar of the collapsing chamber fading behind them. The air was cold and damp, and the walls were lined with more carvings, these ones depicting scenes of unimaginable horror, humans twisted into monstrous forms, their bodies merging with the shadows, their faces frozen in eternal screams. As they ran, Amina could feel the darkness clawing at her, trying to drag her back. The crystal in her hand was dimming, its light flickering as the energy within it was drained. She stumbled, and Kofi caught her, his face grim with determination. "We have to keep moving," he urged, his voice tense. "We are almost there." But Amina wasn't so sure. The passage seemed to stretch on endlessly, the darkness growing thicker with every step. The whispers of the abyss were louder now, filling her mind with visions of destruction and despair, tempting her to give in, to surrender to the inevitable. Just as she felt she could go no further, the passage opened up into another chamber. This one was smaller, more intimate, with a single stone altar in the center. The walls were covered in symbols, but these were different, softer, gentler, radiating a sense of peace and protection. Amina staggered to the altar, her body trembling with exhaustion. She placed the crystal on the altar, and the symbols began to glow, filling the chamber with a soft, warm light. The whispers of the abyss faded, and for the first time since entering the mountain, Amina felt a sense of calm. Kofi joined her at the altar, his hand resting on her shoulder. "We made it," he said quietly, but there was a note of uncertainty in his voice. Amina nodded, but she knew their journey was far from over. The abyss was still out there, still lurking in the shadows, waiting for the chance to strike. They had won a small victory, but the darkness was patient, and it would not rest until it had claimed them both. And deep down, Amina knew that the final battle was yet to come. Amina and Kofi had won a small victory, but the darkness was patient, and it would not rest until it had claimed them both. Does the darkness claim them both? Join us on the next episode to find out.